Hey there, and welcome to a deep dive requested by you.
Hey everyone.
Today we're wading into, well, quite a stack of documents. They're all connected to this dispute around the film. It ends with us.
Yeah, we've got court filings, some emails, even text messages that have been filed. It really paints a picture of how uh, alleged issues on a set can blow up into these big legal fights.
And fights not just in court, but, in the public eye too.
Exactly. And look, if you've ever tried to read these legal documents, you know they can be dense, lots of jargon, specific legal moves. It's not always clear what's happening if you're not, steeped in that world.
Right. So that's our mission here. We're going to try and unpack these sources together,
Yeah.
cut through the legalese.
Figure out who's involved, what the main arguments are, the legal tactics being used, and also look at how the story itself is being shaped. We want to help you make sense of it all.
Think of us as your translators, maybe. We have the official court stuff, complaints, motions, all that.
But also these communications emails, texts that got pulled in as evidence, and that's where you see a lot of the alleged behind-the-scenes stuff.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Based just on these documents we have, who are the key players?
All right, so the sources mention Blake Lively, the actor. Then there's Justin Baldoni. He's listed as co-chairman and co-founder of Wayfarer Studios, but also the director, producer, and an actor in the film.
Okay.
Also, Jamie Heath, the CEO of Wayfarer, also a producer. Wayfarer Studios itself, the production company.
And two more.
Yeah, Jed Wallace and his company, Street Relations, Inc., they're described in these papers as consultants who are brought in.
Got it. And this all connects back to the making of It Ends With Us.
Right. The documents point to things really coming to a head, or at least being formally addressed, around January 4th, 2024. There was an all-hands meeting mentioned. This was after the guild strikes ended.
And why was this meeting called?
The sources say it was called to address a hostile work environment, that's the quote, and that this environment had apparently nearly derailed production.
Wow. Okay, so serious concerns.
Definitely seems that way. And it's in this context, and then later in Mrs. Lively's legal filings that draw on these events, that the sources lay out some really specific allegations about Mr. Baldoni and Mr. Heath.
What kind of allegations?
The documents mention concerns being raised by Mrs. Lively and others about, quote, repeated sexual harassment and other disturbing behavior.
And they get specific.
Very specific. The sources list things people allegedly wanted stopped. Things like showing nude images or videos, discussing personal sex lives or issues of consent, describing genitalia.
Okay.
Also making jokes about HR complaints or missing the HR meeting, asking a trainer about someone's weight without their consent, bringing up Blake's father's death, pressing about her religion, and also a request that an intimacy coordinator had to be present on set that was specifically listed.
And there were more requests later.
Yeah, other lists mentioned in the sources add things like no entering trailers when someone's nude, no private multi-hour meetings where someone's crying without a representative present. Right.
No pressing employees to sage themselves. Also, requests about a producer named Alex Sachs getting standard rights and wanting Sony to oversee the physical production side.
And part of the background here, alleged in the documents, is that Wayfarer hadn't provided some basic things.
That's alleged, yeah. Things like a proper employee handbook, a sexual harassment policy, or even information and training on these issues, basic employment protections.
And because of all this, they negotiated something specific.
Seems so. The documents mention a contract writer was negotiated. Basically, an addition to a contract, specifically about Mr. Baldoni's and Mr. Heath's conduct on the set going forward.
So you have these workplace issues boiling up, leading to contract changes, and then, inevitably, perhaps, lawsuits.
Exactly. And it's crucial to understand, right from the start, the sources show there isn't just one lawsuit. There are multiple legal actions flying around.
Okay, this is where it can get confusing for people tracking different cases. So what's the main one mentioned? Well, the documents reference a case where Wayfarer Studios and others are suing Blake Lively and others. That one's filed in federal court in New York, the Southern District, or SDNY.
Wayfarer suing Lively in New York. Got it.
But then there's another lawsuit the sources talk about. This one was filed against Mrs. Lively by Jed Wallace and Street Relations, and that one's down in Texas, the Western District of Texas.
Oh, okay. So different people suing each other in different states, why they're in different places. That's probably part of the strategy, right?
Absolutely. Figuring out where a case should be heard or trying to get it heard where you want it, that's a huge part of legal strategy. The documents really show that fight playing out.
Okay, let's break down some of the legal terms the documents use. First up, subpoena. What is that in plain English?
Sure. A subpoena is basically a formal legal order from a court. Usually it's sent to someone who isn't one of the main parties in the lawsuit, like a witness or maybe a bank or another company.
And what does it order them to do?
Typically, either to produce documents or records or to show up and testify. It's a demand for information.
Okay. And the documents mention Wayfarer sent a subpoena to a law firm, Venable LLP.
That's right. In that New York case, Wayfarer sent Venable a subpoena asking for documents.
But Venable didn't just hand them over.
No. If you get a subpoena and you think there's something wrong with it, maybe it's asking for irrelevant stuff or privileged information or it's just overly broad, you can file something called a motion to quash.
Quash means cancel.
Essentially, yeah. You're asking the judge, please invalidate the subpoena, cancel this demand. And the documents show Venable did file a motion to quash.
But then what happened? Did the judge decide?
Actually, no. Another document shows the motion became moot. That's another legal term you see a lot.
Moot, meaning?
It means the issue doesn't need a decision anymore. It's irrelevant to the court's proceedings. In this case, the sources say it became moot because Wayfarer withdrew the subpoena. They pulled back their demand.
Okay, so if the demand is gone, the request to cancel the demand is pointless.
Exactly. No need for the judge to rule. So the motion became moot. It's a common little dance you see: demand, challenge, withdrawal.
Gotcha. Okay, stepping back. How does a lawsuit actually start? What's the first big document?
That's called the complaint. It's the document filed with the court by the person or company starting the lawsuit. They're called the plaintiff.
And it's filed against the person or company they're suing.
Right, the defendant. The complaint lays out all the factual allegations, explains why the plaintiff thinks the defendant did something wrong, and states the legal claims like breach of contract or negligence, or in this case, other things.
Okay. Now, the sources mention Mrs. Lively took a step before filing a traditional complaint in court, something involving the California Civil Rights Department, the CRD.
Yes, this is really important, especially for workplace issues in California. The documents show she filed a complaint with the CRD back in December 2024.
And there's also mention of a right to sue notice. How does that fit in?
Okay, so under California law and some federal laws too, like Title VII for claims like workplace harassment or discrimination, you often can't just go straight to court. You usually have to file a complaint with an administrative agency first, like the CRD in California or the EEOC federally.
Why is that?
It gives the agency a chance to investigate the claim, maybe try to mediate a settlement. It's called exhausting administrative remedies. Once that agency process is done or enough time passes, the agency issues what's called a right to sue notice.
And that notice is like permission to go to court.
Exactly. It's your ticket. It confirms you've gone through the required administrative step, and now you are officially permitted to file your lawsuit in actual court.
So Mrs. Lively's CRD complaint was that first step. Who did she name in it?
According to the sources, her CRD complaint named Wayfarer, Baldoni, Heath, Jed Wallace, Street Relations, and others. And the allegations mentioned relate to California's FEHA law and federal Title VII covering things like sexual harassment, retaliation, failure to prevent harassment, and aiding and abetting these things.
Okay, so the CRD process is a prerequisite for these kinds of claims in California. Now let's jump back to that other case, the one in Texas, where Wallace and Street are suing Blake Lively.
Right.
The documents show her response was to file a motion to dismiss. What's the goal of that?
A motion to dismiss is a defendant's first major countermove. They're basically saying to the judge, look at the plaintiff's complaint. Even if you assume everything they're saying is true for the sake of argument, they still don't have a valid legal case. Or, this court is the wrong place for this case, so please just throw it out now.
Dismiss it before it even really gets going.
That's the idea. Save everyone time and money. Ms. Lively filed one asking the Texas court to dismiss Wallace and Street's lawsuit against her entirely.
And her motion gives specific legal reasons based on court rules. I see references like Rule 12b-2.
Yeah, those are references to the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, the rule book for federal court cases. Rule 12b lists several reasons why a case might be dismissed early on.
So what's Rule 12b-2? Lack of personal jurisdiction.
Okay, personal jurisdiction is about the court's power over the defendant. For a court in a particular state, like Texas, to have power over a defendant like Blake Lively, there usually needs to be some connection between the defendant and that state related to the lawsuit.
So she has to have done something connected to Texas.
Generally, yes. Enough minimum contacts, as the lawyers say. Her argument, according to the sources, is, I live in New York. The things they're suing me about didn't primarily happen in or target Texas. Therefore, this Texas court doesn't have the authority, the jurisdiction over me for this lawsuit.
And she argues that filing that Rule 202 petition we'll discuss later doesn't count as her agreeing to be sued there.
Right, she says just using that preliminary Texas procedure doesn't mean she subjected herself to being sued in Texas on the main claims. The sources mention her citing a famous Supreme Court case, Calder v. Jones, which deals with when out-of-state actions can create jurisdiction.
So, argument 1, Texas court has no power over me. What's argument 2? Rule 12b-3, improper venue.
Venue is about the location of the court. Even if a state does have jurisdiction, the lawsuit might need to be filed in a specific district within that state based on where events occurred or where parties reside.
So is it the right spot in Texas?
Kind of. Mrs. Lively argues that even if Texas could have jurisdiction, the Western District of Texas isn't the proper specific courthouse district for this case. She argues the key events Wallace and Street are complaining about, mainly her CRD filing, didn't happen in that district.
Okay. Jurisdiction is about power over the person. Venue is about the right location. What's the third big argument? Rule 12b-6, failure to state a claim.
This one attacks the substance of the claims themselves. It argues that the plaintiff's allegations, even if true, simply don't add up to a recognized legal wrong that the court can provide a remedy for.
Like, what you're complaining about isn't actually illegal or something I can be sued for.
Exactly. Mrs. Lively argues that the specific legal claims Wallace and Street brought against her, one for declaratory judgment and one for defamation, fail to meet the legal requirements needed to even be considered a valid claim.
Let's look at those two claims they made. First, declaratory judgment. What were they asking the Texas court to declare?
A declaratory judgment asks the court to make a formal statement about the legal rights or obligations of the parties involved. Like, court, please declare that Mrs. Lively's actions were improper, or something along those lines. It's often meant to resolve uncertainty and prevent future disputes.
But Mrs. Lively argues it should be dismissed.
Yes. Her motion, per the sources, argues a few things. That declaratory judgment isn't really a standalone claim here. It has to be attached to some other valid legal issue, which she says they don't have.
And she also accuses them of filing tactically.
Right. She characterizes it as a preemptive lawsuit filed first to try and get a favorable ruling and forum shopping, trying to pick a court they think will be better for them, namely Texas instead of New York, where she might sue them.
Okay. What about their second claim, defamation? That's about damaging someone's reputation with false statements, right?
Correct. That's the basic idea.
And why does Ms. Lively argue that claims should be dismissed?
Well, her motion apparently argues they haven't been specific enough about what allegedly false statements she made. But the really big argument highlighted in the sources is privilege.
Privilege. We talked about subpoenas, now privilege and defamation. What does that mean here?
Okay, so privilege in the context of defamation is a legal shield. The law recognizes that in certain situations, it's so important for people to be able to speak freely, even if what they say might be critical or negative, that they should be protected from defamation lawsuits for statements made in that context.
What kind of contexts?
Things like statements made in court proceedings, during legislative sessions, or crucially here when making official reports about things like workplace harassment or discrimination to the proper authorities.
So it connects back to that CRD filing.
Exactly. Mrs. Lively's motion argues that the statements she made in her CRD complaint about the alleged sexual harassment and discrimination are protected by what's called litigation privilege, or a similar statutory privilege under California law. Specifically, the sources mention California Civil Code Section 47.1, which provides protection for communications related to reporting harassment.
So the argument is essentially, you can't sue me for defamation based on what I said in my legally required CRD complaint, because the law protects those statements to encourage reporting.
That's the core of the privilege argument, yes. Saying the public policy interest in allowing people to report alleged misconduct outweighs the defendant's interest in suing for defamation based on those specific reports. It's a very powerful defense if it applies.
Really highlights how the specific context of a statement is critical in the eyes of the law.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned we'd come back to that Rule 202 petition. The sources say Mrs. Lively filed one in Texas before Wallace Street sued her there. Remind us what that is.
Right. So Texas Rule 202 is a specific procedural tool unique to Texas law. It allows someone to ask a Texas court for permission to conduct limited discovery, usually taking someone's deposition under oath before filing a formal lawsuit.
Why would you do that?
Usually to investigate whether you actually have a valid claim, or to identify the right parties to sue, or to preserve testimony. The sources say Mrs. Lively filed one to investigate Jed Wallace's role and alleged actions.
But in her motion to dismiss the lawsuit against her, she says filing that Rule 202 petition doesn't mean she agreed to be sued in Texas.
Correct. Her argument is, I used a specific Texas tool just to investigate a potential claim, as the rule allows. That exploratory step doesn't suddenly give Texas courts broad jurisdiction over me for any lawsuit Wallace wants to bring later.
Wow, that's intricate. It really shows how these legal battles aren't just about the main conflict, but also about these really specific procedural fights over rules and location.
Totally. These fights over jurisdiction, venue, procedure, they happen all the time. They can be incredibly important, sometimes even deciding the outcome before you ever get to the merits of the case itself. It's all strategy.
Okay, so we've waded through some pretty dense legal concepts. Subpoenas, motions to quash, complaints, CRD filings, motions to dismiss, jurisdiction, venue, privilege.
Quite the journey through civil procedure.
But the documents we have don't just talk about court stuff. They also reveal this whole other dimension to the conflict, a fight over the public narrative involving PR strategies.
Yes, this is where it gets really fascinating and maybe a bit disturbing. The legal filings themselves, particularly from Miss Lively's side, contain detailed allegations about a public relations campaign.
And they specifically name Jed Wallace.
They do. Mrs. Lively's filing, pulling from communications submitted as evidence, describes him pretty bluntly as a hired gun, someone specializing in things like untraceable campaigns, digital manipulation, and even social combat. Strong words.
Social combat?
Wow. And what was the alleged goal of this campaign involving Wallace, Street Relations, and another group mentioned, TAG, led by Melissa Nathan? The sources, including references to a document apparently titled Scenario Planning, lay out the alleged objective pretty clearly. First, to protect the reputation of Justin Baldoni, Jamie Heath, and Wayfarer Studios. That makes sense.
But there was more.
Allegedly, yes. The filings claim the campaign also aimed to, quote, shift public attention from stories about Baldoni's misconduct into a manufactured and harmful narrative about Mrs. Lively.
A manufactured narrative.
Right.
And there was even stronger language.
Yeah, the documents quote a phrase allegedly used indicating the goal was for Mrs. Lively to be buried.
Be buried. That's chilling to read in a court document. What kinds of tactics did they allegedly use in this PR war?
The sources list several. Hiring Melissa Nathan and TAG is mentioned, and the filing notes Nathan's prior work on Johnny Depp's crisis PR team. There's talk of developing a social combat plan and engaging in social manipulation.
Which means what, exactly? Trying to influence online discussions.
Seems like it. The allegations, backed by purported communications in the filings, suggest efforts to influence content on social media, Reddit, TikTok, Instagram, X, Twitter, and also online news outlets.
Are there examples of these communications?
Yes, the filings describe or, quote, alleged emails and texts. For instance, discussing using friendly reporters. One email allegedly talks about a friend who hates Blake and was armed and ready to push a story about Blake weaponizing feminism to specific outlets like People, Fox News, Us Weekly, In Touch.
So actively pitching negative stories to specific media contacts.
That's the allegation. There are also alleged texts discussing boosting pro-Justin or anti-Blake content online, and specifically engaging in the comment sections, presumably to steer the conversation.
What kind of narrative were they allegedly trying to create about Lively?
The sources suggest they tried to paint her as someone who had steamrolled or bulldozed Baldoni and Wayfarer, especially regarding creative decisions like the film's final cut.
And it wasn't just about her.
Apparently not. The alleged texts also mention attempts to drag her husband, Ryan Reynolds, into it, trying to plant a false story about him saving the movie in a way that would make him look anti-feminist. Just really trying to shift the focus and generate negativity.
Are there any other revealing texts mentioned?
Yeah, there are alleged texts noting that the socials are really ramping up against Lively, with a comment that it's sad because it just shows you have people really want to hate on women.
And didn't you say even Melissa Nathan, who was allegedly part of this, expressed some discomfort?
That's right. A striking passage cited in the sources is an alleged text from Nathan herself, where she seems disturbed by the tone of some comments being pushed about Blake, specifically mentioning sexual connotations. She's quoted saying things like the whispering in the ear, the sexual connotations, like Jesus fucking Christ, other members feeling uncomfortable watching it. I mean, there's just so much.
That's quite something. Suggests even someone involved might have felt it went too far.
It certainly adds a complex layer to the allegations. And it's interesting to juxtapose all this alleged behind-the-scenes maneuvering with Mr. Baldoni's public persona, which is also referenced in the sources.
Like his TED Talk.
Yeah, his 2017 TED Talk, Why I'm Done Trying to Be Man Enough, where he talks about vulnerability, challenging traditional masculinity, and explicitly says men are the problem. And his Man Enough podcast deals with themes like supporting women, consent, boundaries.
A very public stance on these issues.
Very much so. Statements about men needing to show up. The sources also note that around the time of the film's promotion, his public messaging pivoted somewhat to focus on the film's themes of surviving abuse and also discussing his own ADHD diagnosis as potentially explaining behaviors he was accused of, like social awkwardness and impulsive speech.
So you have this public image focused on accountability and sensitivity, contrasting sharply with these allegations in the court documents about a private strategy to bury, lively, and manipulate the narrative.
That's the tension presented in the sources, yes. And Mrs. Lively's lawsuit frames that alleged PR campaign not just as aggressive, but specifically as a retaliatory campaign payback for her speaking up about the alleged workplace misconduct in the first place.
Okay, we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
Alleged misconduct, the intricacies of legal filings and motions, and now these detailed claims about a PR war fought online and through media. Let's bring it back to the listener. Why should someone care about wading through all this legal and PR detail?
Well, first off, it's a real-time case study in how these things actually work. Forget the TV dramas. This shows you the real tools lawyers use motions to dismiss based on jurisdiction, venue, privilege. You see how procedural rules aren't just technicalities, they're battlegrounds.
And it really highlights how complicated these things get, right? It's not just one simple story.
Not at all. You see how a dispute can escalate from internal complaints to multiple lawsuits across different states, with claims piling on top of claims, misconduct, then alleged retaliation, then defamation suits in response. It's layers upon layers.
And the PR angle feels particularly relevant today.
Absolutely. This case, as presented in the sources, is a stark illustration of how legal strategy and public relations strategy can be deeply intertwined. The documents allege a conscious effort to fight the battle not just in court, but in the court of public opinion, using digital tools and media connections.
It makes you think twice about the narratives you see online surrounding high-profile disputes.
It really should. It's a reminder to be critical consumers of information, to look beyond the headlines or the loudest voices, and to understand that there might be complex legal arguments and potentially calculated PR moves happening just beneath the surface. Digging into sources like these court filings, while challenging, can offer a much more nuanced view.
So we started on the film set with those initial concerns about the work environment.
Then we navigated the legal maze: subpoenas, complaints, motions, understanding why privilege or jurisdiction are such key terms.
And finally, we explored the allegations found within those same legal documents of a deliberate campaign to shape the public story, potentially in retaliation.
It's quite a journey, from workplace friction to multi-state litigation and alleged social combat.
So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with. How much is our understanding of these conflicts shaped not just by the facts or even the legal rulings, but by these deliberate efforts to control the narrative that happens alongside, or even instead of, the formal process?
Yeah, what does it really mean when, as alleged here, the legal fight is paired with a strategy aiming to publicly bury the opponent? How does that shape truth and perception?
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.